Hi, Michelle Glass here, and we're back with another installment in our Lecture 1 series. And our topic for this presentation is looking more at that characteristic or property of life, that life is ordered. So let's get started. So when we talk about life being ordered, we can look at this from the big picture first and then go to smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller levels of organization. So we're all familiar with an organism. We're organisms. We know that our dog and our cat and our fish and the birds and the tree are all organisms. So we're looking at, in most cases, multicellular or complex organisms, and we can see that organisms are organized into organ systems. So we know about that, especially with animals. We're familiar with the digestive system and the cardiovascular system and the nervous system. Those systems are, of course, collections of organs that are working together for a specific function. And those organs are themselves made out of tissues, which are different groups of cells working together to form those organs. Tissues, as I've just said, are made up of cells. And cells are important because this is the smallest unit of life. And this is consistent across the board, whether we're looking at humans or oak trees or mushrooms or bacteria. The cell is the smallest unit of life. And how do we know that it's alive? Well, of course, it has all those characteristics or properties of life that I've already introduced to you. So the cell is able to respond and regulate its internal environment and process energy and adapt. And it's ordered, it's organized. So as we study the cell this semester, we'll see that there are small structures inside the cell that have special jobs. And we know that cells can reproduce, and we'll study that process this semester. And cells are also able to grow and develop just like organisms themselves grow and develop. In fact, some organisms are only made up of cells. So those would be, of course, unicellular organisms, meaning a single cell. That would be different from humans, which are multicellular organisms, meaning trillions of cells are composing our bodies. Now, the cell is alive, so that means the tissue and the organ system, and of course the organism is considered to be alive as well. Now, cells themselves are composed of molecules, which are composed of atoms. And this chemical level of life, these molecules and these atoms, are not considered to be alive. They don't have those characteristics of life. But when they come together, they are making that living cell. Now, I've reversed my arrows, if you've noticed, so that the atom is the smallest level or the smallest organization to life, where life itself does not begin until we're at the cellular level, and the organism is like the largest scale there. I've already mentioned that even though your atoms and your molecules are not alive, when they come together to form the cell, you now get this property of life. This idea of a new property emerging at each level can be referred to as emergent properties. And this is an important theme that we'll see in our biological study. So just like the atoms and the molecules that are not alive come together to make a cell, which now is alive, cells themselves have different properties from when they're put together in the context of making an epithelial tissue or your blood tissue or your bone tissue. And then as you start to put those organs together into organ systems, now you have something that's more complicated in the digestive system versus, say, just your stomach. Not only are individual organisms, considered to be ordered, but life on the entire planet is really organized. In some cases, we've just kind of applied this organization because humans like organization, but we can define our terms. So when we're talking about planet Earth, we can refer to it as the biosphere. So this would include your atmosphere, and this would include all of the different ecosystems on the planet. And when we look at the term ecosystem, that's referring to the organisms that live in a particular area, but also non-living components. Non-living components would be things like soil and rock, minerals. It would be temperature and rainfall and sunlight, so things that are going to affect the life itself. Ecosystems are composed of communities, and a community would be all of the organisms found at that particular ecosystem. So look at your term ecosystem as referring to the living and non-living components, and the term community is referring just to the living components. Now this is all the organisms that are found in that particular area. So again, this would include bacteria, and this would include fungus, mushrooms, and this would include your plants and your little unicellular protists and your complex animal. All of that life would be considered part of the community. And then from there, we can talk about populations. Populations are going to be groups of individuals of the same species. And this term species we'll define again a little bit later in this presentation, but the significance here is that a population, by definition, is a group that could breed together. So you're basically, when you're talking about a population, you're talking about a gene pool. You're talking about individuals that are going to interact with each other, maybe to help each other survive, or maybe as part of reproduction, mixing of genetics. That's what we're talking about with population. Community is talking about all of those organisms. Remember, in the case of population, we don't typically see you wouldn't have like a prey and a predator in the same population, right? Because you're either talking about that prey species or that predator species. In the case of community, you are talking about the prey, the predator, the decomposer, the plant, all of that together. And then once we have organized life on the planet down to the species level, then we can look at the individuals. And remember, individuals are organized into the organism, organ system, organs, tissues, cells, and then the molecules, which are composed of atoms. So here on this particular slide, we see the progression from the very largest type of classification down to the very smallest type of classification. What's interesting here is, again, new properties are emerging at each level. So as biologists, we can be interested in the molecules that make up life, or we can be interested just in studying the cell, or we can study just the tissue, or we can be interested in studying it at the population level. So we can study a particular species and become an expert there, or we can be interested in studying it at the community or the ecosystem level. So we'll see biologists can learn things about life on our planet by studying it at each of these different levels. And so that's really the purpose to introduce it here. Now, as we start to talk about our organisms, we will see that this term taxonomy is referring to how we organize and classify and name organisms, and it's really based on relationship, and we're looking in large part at genetic relationships. So since we've been able to extract and sequence DNA, we're really able to do DNA analysis to compare relationships between organisms. And before that, we looked at characteristics such as their job in the ecosystem or how they look. And taxonomy is really the study then of how organisms are related to each other, how they are classified, and what they are named. We can divide all of life on the planet into one of three possible domains. So this is our largest heading of how organisms can be classified. So our three domains consist of the Archaea, the bacteria, and the eukarya. Now, the Archaea and the bacteria are probably the domain that you're least familiar with. These are all microscopic organisms. They're all classified as prokaryotes, and we'll be talking about what it means to be a prokaryotic cell as we progress into, I think, about chapter 3, we'll really start defining that. So that's coming up in the future. So these two groups can be thought of as closer related to each other versus the eukarya because they are all prokaryotic cells, microscopic, unicellular organisms. Now, the key difference for us really to know between the archaea and the bacteria is that the archaea are prokaryotic cells that are living in extreme environments. So we'll see these in places like hot ocean vents and places where there's not oxygen, but instead organisms living off of sulfur and these other sorts of extreme types of environments. Your bacteria are the prokaryotic cells that you are the most familiar with. I'm sure you've heard before of E. coli or strep infections is caused by a bacterium called Streptococcus. You've heard of maybe staph infections, which is caused by bacterium in the genus Staphylococcus. So you've heard a few of these. You know that bacteria are responsible for a lot of infections in humans and foodborne illnesses and so forth. And so you're somewhat familiar with them in that context. Eukarya are the more complex organisms. So these do include unicellular organisms all the way up through humans or multicellular organisms. The signature difference is that all of these organisms in this domain have a eukaryotic type of cell. And again, we'll talk in the future about the key differences between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. So we'll be talking about those. As we look at our domain eukarya, this is really where our focus will be this semester. You can further classify your organisms in your eukarya domain into kingdom. And we will see that there are really 4 accepted kingdoms. We have the protists, which have been classified as a kingdom in the past, but now are recognized as a pretty diverse group. So that's not really going to be called a kingdom any longer, but we do see in our text it's just separated out as this whole diverse group of protists. These are things like green algae and amoeba and paramecium that you may or may not be familiar with. A lot of plankton in the ocean would be protists. And then you have the kingdom fungi, which you are familiar with this. This includes your mushrooms and your molds, your plantae, which of course are your photosynthetic organisms, and then we belong in kingdom Animalia, so we're pretty familiar with that kingdom as well. As you move into biology 2, you will be investigating the Animalia kingdom and the plantae kingdom in a lot more detail. We can next classify organisms in those kingdoms down to phylum. So when you start breaking them down into phyla, which is the plural form of the word, you are further grouping them in those relationships. Now this description is given to us in chapter 15. So if you do want to make sure that you're reading this information, everything else in the presentation has been in chapter 1, and this information now picks up in chapter 15. From phylum, we can classify into class, from their order, family, genus, and species. And notice that we're going from a large classification that's including a lot of different animals down to more and more and more and more and more and more specific. As we get more and more specific, those organisms are more closely related to each other. So as you're breaking them down into those different taxonomic groups, you're separating out these are more similar and these are more distantly related. We use those last 2 classifications for our binomial naming system. The term binomial means 2 names. And so all of our scientific names, all of our organisms are assigned a 2-part name. The first part of the name is genus, and the second part of the name is the species. Now, the genus name is always written in a capital letter, and the species name is always lowercase. Notice, too, that I've written these by hand, and so I've underlined my genus and species name. But if I was typing these up, then I would be sure and use italics. So if you do need to write out your scientific names, like for your lab report, If you need to write one, then you want to make sure that you're doing your Control I on your keyboard to italicize those names correctly. This binomial scientific naming system was developed in the 18th century by Carl Linnaeus. So very often it'll be referred to by the Linnaean binomial naming system. Now the significance here is that your genus is indicating groups of species that are very closely related. So the genus classification is the kind of closest relationship, or the more separated out group. And then the species, remember, is the most specific. When we talk about species, I'm going to go back. When we're talking about species, we're really talking about a breeding group, so they can share and mix genetic information. There are lots of different ways to define species, and this is kind of a loose definition that is changing, is flexible, depending on who you talk to. But for the most part, biologists follow what's called the biological species concept, which means that it's a reproductively isolated group. So this means that they can mate together and they can produce viable offspring. In order to be a reproductively isolated group, you have to, in nature, be able to come across each other, attract each other, produce offspring that are then able to survive in that environment, and the offspring are equally able to attract mates and produce a viable offspring. So the idea here is you're able to reproduce. So we have lots of different breeds of dogs, but if those dogs come together, they can mate and they can produce a mixed breed dog. So that it tells us from the biological species concept that dogs are all members of the same species. Now, you may be able to cross a dog and a wolf, but in nature, they're not likely to run in the same circles. They're not likely to attract each other. And then their offspring may or may not be accepted in either the wolf population or the dog population. And so, that's partially how we would designate the wolf and the dog as different species. Or you can have the example of a horse and a donkey. They can mate, they produce a mule, but the mule is sterile, the mule is unable to reproduce, and so the mule is not considered viable offspring, even though it is offspring of these two distinct species. So that helps us to designate the horse and the donkey as separate species. Now let me go back. We've already mentioned that, the taxonomic classifications are showing us relatedness, where those larger designations are the more distantly related groups, but they still are related to each other. And as you move through the different taxonomic classifications, getting down to species level, those are the most closely related organisms in the group. This organization is based on, as mentioned, physical appearance, so things that you can just observe. Genetic similarity, so that's based on DNA extraction and sequencing and analysis. And also another characteristic that's used is embryological development. So being able to study the developmental progressions, really that's connected into the genetics that's orchestrating all of those developments. We can detect some relationships between organisms that way. Okay, and that's it.